The American War of Independence is often unfairly seen as mostly a local conflict of a global empire seeking to hold on to their unruly colony, with the role of nations like France and Spain restricted to providing guns and ships, and so the balance shifts, and the US was born as a powerful, independent state. Yet, it is not an overestimation to say that this war was, essentially, a world war, a sequel to the famous 7 Years' War, where France and Britain had fought for North American, Indian and European hegemony. During the American Revolutionary War, once again, all of these regions saw conflict in one form or another. Thus, today we will ask the question of what the four principal powers, Britain, America, France and Spain, actually wanted out of this global conflict. Now let's start off with the principal participant in this war, the rebels who set the world on fire. Aside from their very obvious goal of simply gaining independence and/or autonomy within the British Empire, I think just from this map you might be able to guess what the maximum hopes of the US roughly were. Yet, let's explore a bit deeper. There is a big difference between dreams and what might actually have been achievable, as both the reality of the war and negotiations with allies would impact what the US could seriously demand. As mentioned, at the start, simple autonomy from Britain was a serious consideration, with a sort of federal union being considered, wherein the new US would receive political independence and encompass all British colonies across the continent, but the two powers would remain economically and diplomatically tied. Of course, Britain had no interest in such proposals, and as the war intensified, the US stopped considering them too. From that point, a fully independent state became the goal. But still, what should it look like? Initially, attention was mostly directed north. The importance of Canada was clear to everybody, especially as an early military objective. If it would come under American control, Britain would lack their primary routes to invade from. It could also push the fighting away from cities like New York and Boston to the far less populous north. This importance went further than just the war itself. It was considered at the time that, even if victory was achieved, from Canada, Britain could continue to threaten the new nation, whether directly or through supporting the natives. Quebec was also a particular topic, as the territory had only about a decade ago been conquered by Britain. Britain then had gone on to give the Catholic population of the province the right to their Catholic faith and preserved certain French laws. Most shockingly though, Quebec was radically expanded, which the Protestant colonists really didn't like, as they saw this as undoing the victories achieved in the prior war. Anti-Quebecois language was fierce in the 13 colonies, until the Revolutionary War began. Suddenly, American rhetoric shifted. Numerous diplomatic attempts were made to get Canada to join the revolution, with a heavy focus on the most populous territory of Quebec. The Americans promised that their religious rights would be respected, and in these early days underpinned their desires to simply negotiate a better deal with Britain. Yet, Quebec was still not interested, and the presence of British forces ended any uprisings in Canada. In 1775, a military operation tried and failed an invasion of the region, after which early military defeats and a British invasion meant that there were no longer forces available for such Canadian adventurism. And while the desire never went away, the conquest of Canada became a far less realistic goal. Now, aside from just the military reality forcing America to rethink, their alliance with France changed matters too. On paper, a Franco-American alliance was rather strange. Before the 7 Years' War, the biggest fear of the 13 colonies was the growing influence of the Catholic monarchies on the continent. And, as mentioned, Britain's mild treatment of the Catholic Quebecois was unpopular. Yet, much like how the importance of Quebec was more important than anti-Catholicism, the necessity to gain aid from a major power was also more important than their dislike of Catholic France. Yet still, America initially took an interesting approach to friendship. In 1776, the Americans approved the Model Treaty of Amity and Commerce. This was Congress's suggestion for an alliance with the kings of Spain and France. This treaty perfectly shows the arrogance and naive self-confidence of the early revolution. The treaty quite plainly states that Paris and Madrid were expected to waive all claims to British territories in North America. It was all to go to the Americans, including, if possible, Bermuda and the Bahamas, ensuring American hegemony over the Western Atlantic. As you might imagine, this treaty would not have been very appealing to the Europeans. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But then, a lackluster early war performance and a lack of further revolutions from the Canadians began to humble the Americans, and they dropped this treaty, now seeking a more conventional alliance with France and Spain. As such, their goals now had to consider what might be acceptable to their allies. On paper, you might expect France to have been an issue, seeking to leverage the US to regain their positions on the continent, potentially even ruining American hopes of Canadian expansion fully. But luckily for the Americans, this wasn't the case. France was more focused on other objectives, and they had largely given up on returning to North America. Still, and perhaps surprisingly, France actually did prefer Britain to keep Canada rather than it going to the US. This was for the simple reason that France wanted to keep the US and Britain in permanent conflict, thereby binding the Americans closely to the French. In terms of concrete territorial clashes, France only really put the British West Indies as off-limits to the US. Spain was a far bigger hurdle. They actually held significant territory on the continent, and while they were enthusiastic about weakening Britain, they also realized the danger to their own position if the US became too powerful. Spanish control over North America was mostly theoretical, as it was very lightly settled. Also, supporting the liberal ideals of the Americans could easily backfire, encouraging similar revolutions across their own colonies. As a result, while Spain did help the Americans, they never agreed to an official alliance. France was the connecting piece between the coalition. The main area of dispute between the US and Spain ran between Florida and the Great Lakes. For Spain, gaining control over both sides of the Mississippi would have been very beneficial, giving them a larger buffer against the Americans. Beyond that, gaining western and eastern Florida was considered crucial for rebuilding Spanish power in the Gulf of Mexico. While the US was mostly fine conceding eastern Florida to the Spanish, West Florida was considered more important, exactly because it provided access to the Mississippi and, again, the Gulf of Mexico. At one point, the US even suggested that Florida should pass to them, but in exchange, the Spanish would get to conquer the entire Portuguese Empire. Of course, the US had no way of actually making this happen, and this plan wasn't really pursued. Now, in terms of American desires, I finally want to highlight the ideas of Benjamin Franklin, a chief founding father who had been present as a diplomat at the peace negotiations. As far back as 1776, he had argued it would be better for both sides if war was avoided, and thus he reasoned the British should just sell all of their colonies to the US. That way, the cost of war for both sides would be avoided, and as Franklin and several Americans already believed, American hegemony over the continent was inevitable anyways. Let's just skip over the part where we fight and get to the part where we get rich from trading with each other. He had some other interesting proposals too, like turning the West Indies into a neutral zone, with independent states all nations could trade with. As you might imagine, nobody really liked that idea. Perhaps most famously, he kept pressing for the necessity of Canada during the peace talks, again arguing to Britain the benefit that this would provide them in terms of post-war relations. Beyond that, you may be familiar with the Articles of Confederation. which stated that the Canadians could at any point join the US as a state without having to go through the normal congressional way. Rather hilariously, Franklin had argued that this invitation should extend not just to all of North America and the British Caribbean colonies, but even as far as Ireland. Now with that, we have broadly discussed American desires. Let's now discuss actual peace proposals, and there were a variety of them. One concept particularly disfavorable to the Americans was the concept of uti possidetis, keep what you've got. Considering that at the times this was considered, New York was still occupied by Britain, a treaty on these terms could have led to some very interesting outcomes. Even after the Battle of Yorktown, essentially the end to the North American theater, the US still controlled little beyond their core territory, and Long Island and the Georgian coast was still British. If such an idea had passed, the US may have ended up with little beyond just the 13 colonies. For most of the war, the idea of a uti possidetis peace was popular amongst all the European powers. But after the Battle of Yorktown, Britain seemed weak enough that France and Britain became more interested in extracting greater concessions from Britain. The next issue then became the fate of Trans-Appalachia. As mentioned before, both Spain and the US had interest in the region. Britain obviously did too, and France sought to ensure that the US didn't become too powerful. The alternate proposals discussed historically could have been devastating to US power. For example, the Count of Aranda, the Spanish ambassador to France, had suggested a division along these lines. In this case, American expansion west could have been far more difficult. The Count of Vergennes, the French foreign minister, arguably had an even worse suggestion, where Britain would have kept all territory north of the Ohio River, and the Spanish got most of the southern territories. What fantastic allies these are. Now the most prominent American counter-proposal, beyond Benjamin Franklin continuing to demand all of Canada, was the Nipissing Line. This suggested that, beyond what the US already got in our timeline, most of what is today Ontario would also become American. Now keep in mind, this is the region where by far most Canadians today live, and would have given the US far greater control over the Great Lakes. Now by this point you may wonder, if Spain and France would have likely supported Britain in reaching a treaty like this, how did the US end up gaining all of this territory? Well, the Americans and the British decided to cut out the other Europeans from the negotiations. Britain hoped that by supporting the treaty of our timeline, rather than the one supported by France, they would drive a wedge between the Americans and the French, and therefore the US would return to being a British partner. In the end, the only American territory Spain did gain was Florida, though part of it became contested between Spain and the Americans. On the whole, especially considering the alternatives, the treaty was a very acceptable settlement to the Americans. So, to quickly summarize, the US wanted it all. Every British territory in North America and the Caribbean was in some sense a legitimate goal, with the most enthusiastic patriots even musing about Ireland. Yet, the reality of war sharpened what the Americans could and couldn't expect. Areas like Florida were acceptable losses in exchange for an alliance with Spain. Britain's naval hegemony relegated any desired island gains mostly to fantasy. Canada did remain a very persistent goal, but Britain's military presence and a lack of large-scale Canadian Revolution forced the Americans to give up on those desires and refocus on the West. In this, they did successfully foil a plan that would have made the US only half as big as historically, achieving very impressive expansion, putting themselves on the banks of the Mississippi, an absolutely crucial position for the future expansion of the state. Let us then move on to the next most important member of the anti-Britain coalition, France. Arguably the diplomatic, military and economic heart of the war effort, without which Spain would have remained neutral and the Patriots would have had a significantly harder time in their own fight. even putting the success of the revolution in jeopardy. Surely, France has massive goals for this war. Well, it might surprise you to learn that French goals were actually pretty modest. The common narrative is that after the devastating defeat of the 7 Years' War, France was burning with revanchist desires to destroy Britain. Yet, it is more complicated than that. The leaders of France were actually quite pragmatic during this war. After their last defeat, Britain had cemented itself the dominant European power overseas. France didn't necessarily seek to destroy Britain, but that they had to be taken down to the level of the others. The reason for this French position was called calculated geopolitics. If France was to destroy Britain, this would once more make France the biggest target within Europe. For another, the power of Russia in the east was growing rapidly, and France had hoped that Britain could support their efforts to defend the Ottoman Empire. Finally, it was a real concern that if France looked like it was going to destroy Britain, the war could expand across Europe. With finances already strained, other great power interventions could have forced France to back down to avoid bankruptcy. This careful policy also applied to North America, as I have alluded to before. France made it very clear that they did not necessarily support American expansion, and they had hoped to create a situation where Britain and the US remained in constant competition, which would mean that the US would be forced to rely on France, essentially turning them into a French satellite state. This is also why France never really pressed for the reconquest of their former territories, as this would risk the US going back to seeking closer ties to Britain, and besides, such territories would be near undefendable in the next war. Now that is not to say that France was without ambition. Fishing rights in Newfoundland were a major objective for all four major powers. Not only was this simply a very lucrative trade, these fisheries were also considered a training ground for sailors, who could then serve in the war navy, therefore being crucial in the continual naval arms race. Thus, the acquisition of Newfoundland, or at least fishing rights around it, was a French goal. And while broad-scale reconquests were rejected, the restoration of some territory around the St. Lawrence was considered. In Africa, trading outposts, mainly Senegal, should be reconquered. Then, while barely visible on my maps, the West Indies were arguably the most direct French goal. The sugar plantations here were extremely lucrative, and they also played an important role in controlling trade with the massive Spanish empires. Amongst these islands, some had been conquered by Britain during the 7 Years' War, and France wanted them back. But really, all the other islands were objectives too. Finally, in India, France sought a restoration of their position in the south, from where they could once more compete with Britain for influence. Now, in order to achieve victory, France and Spain considered a naval invasion of the British Isles. Two plans were considered. The first calling for a direct attack on southern England, with smaller invasions of Ireland and Scotland. The second plan called for a smaller attack focused on Ireland specifically. Spain generally favoured the larger invasion, but France favoured the Irish plan for a number of reasons. Mainly, their fears of the war expanding if they marched on London, but also because they hoped they could frame an invasion of Ireland as a minor war of liberation rather than a hostile conquest of Britain. Another aspect of the Irish plan is that France believed that Ireland was on the verge of a revolution quite like the American one, and they just had to light the spark with an invasion. It had even been suggested to send some 2,000 American patriots to Ireland so they could lead this revolution. If Ireland had indeed been successfully conquered, France could then put more pressure on the British mainland, while British access to the Atlantic would become more difficult, and more ship and men would need to come home, leaving their colonies underdefended. Yet, in the end, French ambitions fell short during the war. And the reason for this is simple. They just never got naval superiority. Yes, the Battle of Yorktown was a major victory which ended the war on the continent. but it was mostly a North American victory. Elsewhere, British naval hegemony held, most notably after defeating the French Navy in the Caribbean. Coalition victories outside of the North American theater were very scarce. The Irish invasion and revolution never manifested, France failed to capture the West Indies, and an expedition to India amounted to nothing. Despite the importance of France in aiding the American revolutionaries, when it came to the peace negotiations, they found that their negotiating positions were rather weak. So, pretty much none of their territorial goals were actually accomplished. Diplomatically too, their proposed border plans fell through, as Britain was willing to appease the Americans to ensure that France couldn't dominate the new state as they had hoped. French gains were restricted to the island of Tobago and the return of their colony in Senegal. All in all, these minor gains did very little to offset the economic fallout of the war, with French debt having doubled as a result, which, as you will know, led to the French Revolution. I am sure this is not the outcome that Louis XVI had hoped for. The next nation to discuss is then Spain, and like I said before, they had to balance two conflicting desires. They, much like the French, hoped to weaken the British and use the war to strengthen their own empire. But unlike the French, the Americans were an ideological and territorial threat to the integrity of the Spanish Empire. As a result, the Spanish were the most cynical war participant. They never signed an alliance with the US, and while they did loan them money and help them in fighting, officially they were fighting separate wars. Now, by far the most important Spanish goals were in Europe, with the restoration of the island of Minorca and the outpost of Gibraltar. These British bases hampered Spanish power projection in the Western Mediterranean, but were also simply seen as humiliations to the empire. Elsewhere, the Spanish wanted Caribbean and Gulf of Mexican territories, mainly Florida, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and the British Central American territories. Securing these would have once more made Spain the master of those seas and ensured that British traders operating from those territories could no longer smuggle trade with the Spanish colonies. At various points before entering the war, Spain attempted to leverage the mere threat of joining in hopes of convincing Britain to peacefully return Gibraltar and Minorca, even offering to host peace negotiations in Madrid early on in this war, which would have been initially based on the earlier mentioned "keep what you've got." There is little debate that, if Britain just ceded those territories to Spain, the Spanish Empire would have remained neutral. Yet, Britain did not want to give up its influence in the Western Mediterranean, and the Spanish were considered a laughingstock in Britain, their armada no match for the Royal Navy, and their empire weak and ripe for Britain to conquer. Spain then went on to suffer from the same issues as France during the conflict. Their chief victories were accomplished in western Florida and the old Midwest, even capturing a fort in Michigan just to prove a point. Yet elsewhere, most notably in the siege of their coveted Gibraltar, the Spanish failed to accomplish much. At various points, the British considered trading Gibraltar for peace, but a late-war British victory over the besieging Spanish Navy ended this idea. Britain did suggest that they might be open to trading Gibraltar for Puerto Rico or Cuba, but Spain rejected those proposals. At one point, Spain did counter with a three-way trade, where Spain would get Gibraltar, France would get Spanish Santo Domingo, and Britain would either get some French Caribbean islands or perhaps even Corsica. This time, it was France who was not interested. Thus, Spain failed to gain the territory they most desired, Gibraltar. They also failed in their desire to expand their territories east of the Mississippi, and the Caribbean conquest did not manifest. Still, they at least managed to gain the Floridas, even if the Americans would contest the north, and they did successfully recover the island of Minorca. Most importantly, unlike their French allies, the Spanish had not put themselves in immense debt for this war, and their military successes had restored some of the prestige the empire had lost, reminding the world, arguably for the final time, that the Spanish Empire could still be a great power. Now the Dutch are a bit strange for this video. They were in the war, so for the sake of completion, I decided not to completely ignore them. Yet, unlike France and Spain, the Dutch didn't choose to join this war. It was Britain which declared war on them. By this point, the once hegemonic Dutch trading empire had mostly collapsed, and their once most powerful navy in the world had fallen into disrepair. Yet, their influence was not fully gone, and Dutch traders, through their connections to formerly held territories in New York, were one of the major suppliers of the revolution. As a result of this trade, Britain decided to declare war, also enthusiastic about the prospect of seizing Dutch colonies around the world. This war was a total disaster for the Dutch. Their already struggling economy would collapse as various colonies were occupied. Britain would blockade the Dutch coast and harass and capture trading ships and routes. There was some hope for a fast conclusion to the war, with Britain offering a rather lenient peace, but the Dutch decided to align themselves to France, in order for France to help defend their colonies. The Dutch didn't really have territorial goals, except fighting to keep what they already had. For example, the British seized the Dutch Caribbean, invaded Dutch Ceylon, and launched an expedition to the Cape Colony. Mostly thanks to the French, these colonies would be returned to the Dutch. Yet, the effects of the war, compounded with many pre-existing issues, would help ignite a Dutch revolution years before the French one, with militias forming and the family of Orange being driven from power. The crisis only ending with a Prussian intervention against the revolutionary. About a decade later, these same revolutionaries would come to power anyways after a French invasion. That then finally brings us to the other chief war participant, Britain. Much like the US, their war goals are best divided in two, as they changed and grew together with the war itself. At the start, their goals were self-evident: the reconquest of their lost colonies. From a British perspective, this was simply an upstart rebellion, and some strong action would get them back in line. Much like with Spain, the idea of recognizing and negotiating with the rebels was considered dangerous, or other colonies might get similar ideas. By the time Britain was considering concessions to the colonies, like refraining from taxing them in the future, the Americans had already set their sights on full independence. Now, beyond their goal of a full reconquest, Britain's objectives changed by circumstance to be a bit smaller in scope. For example, a plan was approved to create a new colony of New Ireland from territories in Maine, where fleeing loyalists could be settled, which would increase Britain's buffer towards the important coastal province of Nova Scotia. Another consideration was to pivot to focus on the reconquest of the South, Georgia and the Carolinas. These were some of the most lucrative territories of the Union through their plantations, and it was thought that without them, the young state would be economically unviable, from which point, even if not immediately reconquered, it would eventually collapse and fall under British influence anyways. Britain also at various times was open to a keep what you've got peace deal, through which they hoped to regain New York, New Jersey, Georgia and South Carolina, allowing the rest to become independent. Again, the idea was that this would make the US an unviable state in the long term, ensuring their eventual return to British hegemony. In that light, while full reconquest was of course the goal, Britain did have a focus on a couple of specific areas during the war. But these were just their North American considerations. The entrance of France and Spain turned the war into a global one for Britain. And while obviously this posed a threat to the empire, and it would make the war a lot more costly, many of the colonial elites were actually highly confident and even enthusiastic. As mentioned, London didn't hold a high opinion of Spain, and they were hoping to repeat the success of the 7 Years' War, where they likewise had fought France and Spain in the colonies. Several ambitious offensives and grand hopes were penned down, most of which were never actually executed, but still, the focus of the British war did begin shifting south. Arguably, this contributed heavily to Britain's defeat later on, as they began stretching themselves too thin. The benefit of the reconquest of the 13 colonies now had to be balanced with the potential value of other imperial objectives. For example, the plantations of the West Indies were arguably more valuable. So if the price for a reconquest is that France succeeds in capturing those, this was not worth it. Beyond that, Britain's holdings in the Western Mediterranean and in the home islands themselves now needed reinforcements, and India needed to be preserved too. Britain was already overstretched, and they'd try their best to make it even worse. Speaking of, you may have noticed that Britain did not actually have any allies during this war. This was not for a lack of trying. Attempts were made at courting Russia to the British side, but they were only interested in the context of British aid in a future war with the Ottomans. At some point, Britain even suggested giving Minorca to the Russians, but it was not enough to convince them. Prussia did seem interested for a while, but this was only in the context of the Bavarian succession crisis, which Austria sought to profit from. Once it became clear that France was not going to support Austria, Prussia likewise had no reason to ally with Britain. Austria itself, quite simply, had no appetite for a costly war with France, and Britain didn't do themselves any favors by harassing all neutral shipping to the US, causing a massive leak of armed neutrality across Europe, including all neutral great powers, to cooperate against the British naval blockade and their naval harassments. But back to the colonial conflict, and how Britain's priorities shifted as the war expanded. Most important is Spain. Spain was, understandably, considered the weak link in the coalition. Especially Lord Germain, the Secretary of State for the colonies, had high hopes for these wars. Many in Britain already considered the Spanish Empire on the brink of collapse, overstretched, underdefended, and incapable of surviving serious pressure. A revolt in Colombia and a native uprising in Peru further added to this belief. A few well-aimed strikes at critical regions could very well tumble the entire thing. A very serious consideration in the mind of Lord Germain was that, if the 13 colonies were indeed lost, why not just compensate them with other colonies from Spain? The main target was initially New Orleans, from where Spanish influence over the Mississippi would surely collapse, with control over the river greatly easing the British war effort against America too. Yet this first, already ambitious plan would fall through, replaced with another, even more ambitious one, characteristic of the shifting priority of London. The attack would initially focus on the province of Nicaragua, splitting Spanish America in two and putting the most viable Atlantic-Pacific connection in British hands. A second expedition could then come via the west, first passing by the Philippines, before making their assault on New Spain. From here, hopes were that relatively small armies of Britain could simply link up with native and independence fighters and march up through the region, with the most radical figures predicting a full collapse of the Spanish Empire, musing about a conquest as deep as Peru. In the end, being overstretched ruined those plans. There simply weren't the troops available for these adventures, and definitely not enough ships, without completely giving up on fighting the Americans. The Pacific campaign also had to be cancelled once the Dutch joined the war, as Britain hoped to have now found an even weaker target. But it is not an exaggeration to say that during this war, for Britain, the entire Spanish Empire was directly or indirectly a target for conquest. In regards to France, Britain had far less extreme objectives. This is primarily because most of their colonies had already been seized in the previous war. There were still a couple of Indian and African factories, but nothing major. Mostly, Britain pursued the conquest of the French West Indies. The Dutch were mostly similar, with some Caribbean islands, some minor African and Indian factories, and most notably, regions like Sri Lanka and Sumatra being contested, as well as an invasion of the valuable Cape Colony being attempted. Now of course, while actual success would have been very unrealistic, it shouldn't be understated that in some sense, the British government was practically attempting a world conquest over the course of this war. Had they been successful, the only other colonial European power left would have been Portugal. And of course, we know that they did fail. In the actual treaty, nothing came of any of the grand ambitions they enjoyed. And of course, they instead lost territory. We've mentioned them before, but for good measure, the most important losses were giving up Florida to Spain, recognizing American independence, and ceding the Northwest Territory to the US. Overall, a significant defeat, but arguably, considering the coalition posed against them, Britain made it out better than might have been expected at the start. So, in conclusion, what I would like you to take away from this video is that the American Revolutionary War was far more than just a local conflict in the Americas. It was far more than France just wanting to destroy Britain, and it was far more than Britain just wanting to reclaim their colonies. It was truly a global conflict. But having looked at the ambitions of the major powers, who actually won? Well, I think it is near undeniable that the US is the largest victor. They secured their independence, and they secured massive territorial expansion. Sure, they didn't achieve their most extreme goals, but conversely, they also prevented some far less beneficial peace treaties. As would become clear in the decades following, the US was now in a fantastic position to dominate the continent. In second place is Spain. They absolutely failed in some of their grander ambitions, and not capturing Gibraltar was a bit of a downer, but still, they recovered some much needed prestige. Their financial situation could handle the war that they fought, and they did take away some crucial territorial expansion. Of course, none of this was enough to prevent the fall of the empire decades later, but that doesn't take away from the decent result here. In third place then, I think we need to place Britain. This may surprise you. After all, objectively, they lost this war. They lost a lot of territory, and they failed in any of their expansionist ambitions. By all accounts, this was a loss. But the main reason I placed Britain third and not fourth is just how easily it could have been worse for them, with especially a full collapse of their North American empire having been far from implausible, and things like the loss of Gibraltar only narrowly avoided. All things considered, after this war, Britain was still the most powerful European empire. Their colonial hegemony was left mostly unthreatened, and they would go on to prove their strength in the upcoming Napoleonic Wars. Finally then, the most decisive loser was France. Or well, arguably the Dutch, but I'm sticking to the actual great powers here. France simply failed in all of their objectives. Britain was not weakened in any substantial way in the long term. France hardly enjoyed any direct territorial benefits, and their hopes of turning the US into a practical French satellite also failed. Not only did France fail to benefit from the war, they also went into heavy bankruptcy to accomplish nothing. The French Revolution, happening a mere 6 years after this war, is indicative of the French failures. And with that, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.